I want you to understand something before I tell you any of this. I do not know, even now, exactly what happened to me. I have the shape of it. I have the cold edges of it. But there is a hole in the middle where the truth should be, and I have stopped trying to fill it with anything except silence. Here is the part one remember clearest, the part that still wakes me up with my hand already reaching for a radio that isn't there. It was 2 a.m, deep into my 4th month at the station, and I was alone in the control room because that was the schedule, because someone always had to be alone in the control room. The storm outside had been running for 6 hours without a name, without a designation, without so much as a line in the log, and I had learned by then not to ask why. I was watching the anemometer readout do something it shouldn't, the needle holding dead still at a wind speed that should have been tearing the antenna mast off the roof, when the radio speaker crackled to life on a frequency we never used for anything but silence checks. It was my voice, reading coordinates. Coordinates I had never recorded, in a tone I don't use, calm in a way I have never once been calm during a storm like that. I sat there and listened to myself speak for 11 seconds, and then it cut to static, and then the lights in the room dimmed to the color of old bruises, and something pressed itself flat against the outer window from the far side of 6 inches of reinforced glass and 40 feet of empty dark. I didn't see a shape. I want to be clear about that because I know what you're picturing, and it wasn't that. I saw the outline of pressure, a place where the frost on the glass reorganized itself instantly into a pattern with too many joints, too many places that bent, and then it was gone, and the wind that should have scattered that frost simply hadn't moved at all. I did not sleep again that week. But to understand why that 30 seconds broke something in me that has never fully repaired, you need to know how ordinary everything was supposed to be. My name doesn't matter much to this story, so I'll leave it where it belongs, folded into the file with the rest of what happened at Kavik Point. I was 34 when I took the assignment, recently divorced, recently unemployed from a meteorology job that had quietly stopped needing me, and the posting came through a federal contractor I'd barely heard of, offering triple the pay of anything comparable for a 12-month rotation at a remote atmospheric research station on Alaska's North Slope. The recruiter called it environmental monitoring, minimal social contact, ideal for candidates seeking isolation. I remember thinking that sentence was almost funny. I didn't know yet that it was the most honest thing anyone would tell me for the rest of the year. The flight in was the last normal thing I experienced for a long time. A small twin-engine charter out of Deadhorse. The pilot a heavy-set man named Purdy who didn't say more than 11 words the entire 2 hours, most of them about weight distribution. Below us the tundra went white and then whiter, broken only by frozen river systems that looked like veins under skin, and then, finally, the station itself, a low, gray, industrial building with a radar dome on the north end and a communications tower strung with ice, sitting on a shelf of land that seemed to have no reason to be inhabited by anyone at all. There were no trees. There was no color. There was a windsock, frozen solid, pointing permanently in one direction regardless of which way the actual wind blew, which I noted and then dismissed as a broken instrument, because that is the kind of thing you dismiss when you have no context yet for what broken really means in a place like that. Ansel Voss met me on the airstrip, if you could call it that, a groomed strip of packed snow with 2 orange flags. He was somewhere past 60, built like a man who had spent decades being cold on purpose, and he shook my hand with a grip that told me nothing about him except that he had done this greeting many times before, for many replacements. "You'll want the parka rated for -60, not -40, he said, by way of introduction. The -40 ones lie. Inside, the station was smaller than I expected and colder than I expected, despite the heating. A cold that lived in the walls themselves, in the concrete, that no amount of forced air seemed to touch. There was a common room with a table bolted to the floor, a kitchen that smelled permanently of instant coffee, a hallway of sleeping quarters with doors that didn't quite seal, and the control room, which was the heart of everything. Banks of monitors, a radar display, a shortwave rig, and a logging terminal that fed into something Voss called the network, though he never explained whose network it was. He walked me through the basics with the flat cadence of a man reciting something he'd said hundreds of times. Temperature readings every hour, on the hour, no exceptions. Barometric logs cross-checked against the automated system twice a shift. Storm systems tracked, categorized, and reported to a regional office whose name I was given but which, when I looked it up later, connected to nothing I could verify. Equipment checks on the tower every second day, weather permitting. And then, almost as an afterthought, folded into the middle of an otherwise mundane list, Certain reports, he said, go in the red binder. Not the terminal. Not the network. The red binder, which lived in a locked drawer, and which I was never, under any circumstance, to photograph, copy, or discuss over any radio channel. I asked him what kind of reports. He looked at me for a moment longer than the question warranted, and said, "You'll know them when they happen." And then he showed me where the spare fuel drums were kept, as if the conversation had never occurred. I want to tell you I pushed harder. I didn't. I had just left a life that had quietly discarded me, and I had a year of silence and a triple paycheck in front of me, and there is a specific kind of exhaustion that makes a person accept strange rules without asking why, because asking why takes energy you don't have anymore. I told myself it was standard government redaction, some Cold War holdover bureaucracy nobody had bothered to update. I unpacked my things into a room with a window that looked out over 400 miles of white nothing, and I told myself that whatever the red binder was, it had nothing to do with me. My first full shift began the next morning at 6, still full dark, the sky the color of wet slate through the reinforced glass. I logged the 6 a.m. temperature, -31 degrees Fahrenheit, unremarkable for the season, and cross-checked the barometric pressure against the automated feed, and everything matched, everything was ordinary, and I remember feeling, for about 4 hours, something almost like relief. Then, at 11:40 that morning, the automated radar system flagged a developing storm cell 40 miles northwest, moving in a pattern the software described as non-standard rotational behavior. Recommend manual verification. And when I looked up from the screen to ask Voss what that meant, he was already standing in the doorway of the control room, watching the same readout over my shoulder, and he said only 4 words, in a voice that had gone quieter than anything he'd said to me yet. That one doesn't get named. Section 2, Routine and the Weight of Silence. I want to describe the shape of an ordinary day at Kavik Point, because the horror of that place never announced itself. It accumulated. It hid inside the parts of the job that were supposed to be boring, and boredom is exactly the kind of thing that makes a person stop paying attention, which I have come to believe was the entire point. The rotation worked like this. 3 of us on site at any given time, cycling through 8-hour shifts around the clock, with a 4th person always somewhere in transit, either flying in to relieve someone due for leave or flying out, though I would come to notice, much later than I should have, how rarely anyone actually flew out on schedule. Voss ran the station with the quiet authority of someone who had done this longer than anyone currently alive on that shelf of tundra, and the other 2 full-time staff were Priya Nandi, who handled most of the radio work and had a laugh that seemed almost defiant against the cold, and Dale Coburn, a maintenance tech in his 50s who spoke mostly in grunts and diagnostics and who I liked immediately, in the uncomplicated way you like someone who does their job well and doesn't ask you personal questions. The temperature logs were the backbone of everything. Every hour on the hour, someone entered the reading from 3 separate instruments: a digital sensor mounted on the north tower, a manual mercury backup inside a Stevenson screen 100 yards from the main building, and a redundant automated feed that fed directly into a terminal none of us had login credentials for beyond viewing. The redundancy struck me as excessive for a research outpost, and when I mentioned it to Priya during my 2nd week, she gave me a look I would come to recognize many times over the following months. A look that wasn't quite discomfort but was adjacent to it, a kind of practiced neutrality. "Regional office likes their numbers to agree with each other," she said, and went back to her charts. The equipment maintenance had its own rhythm. Every 2nd day, weather permitting, someone suited up in the heavy exterior gear and walked the perimeter to check the tower guy wires, the anemometer bearings, the satellite dish alignment, and the generator shed, which ran on a diesel backup that Dale babied like a sick animal. The walk took 20 minutes if the wind was calm and closer to 50 if it wasn't, and during my first month I did it 4 times, and each time I came back inside with the specific, bone-deep cold that doesn't leave your fingers for hours, and each time I felt a strange gratitude toward the building itself, toward its fluorescent lights and its bolted furniture and its smell of diesel and coffee, because outside there was nothing. No trees to break the wind. No animals that I ever saw. No sound except the wind itself, and beneath the wind, on the calmer days, something I can only describe as a texture of silence so complete it had a pressure to it, like the inside of your own skull. The radio reports went out twice a day at the change of the morning and evening shifts, relaying summarized weather data to a regional coordination office identified only by a call sign, Hollow 6, that never once, in all my months there, identified itself with a name, a location, or a human voice that sounded the same twice. Priya handled most of these calls, reading temperature ranges and pressure trends and wind data in the clipped, procedural cadence of someone who has done this so many times the words have lost their meaning, and Hollow 6 would respond with confirmations, occasional requests for clarification, and, very rarely, an instruction that made no sense to me in isolation but that nobody else seemed to find strange. The first time I heard one of those instructions, I was standing near the radio bench refilling my coffee, only half listening, when Hollow 6 operator, a flat, unplaceable voice, neither young nor old, neither male nor female in any way I could pin down, said, "Confirm exclusion protocol on the northwest cell, designate as non-event," and Priya said, "Confirmed, non-event," and wrote nothing down. I asked her about it afterward, as casually as I could manage, and she told me that certain storm systems, under specific atmospheric conditions the regional office had never fully explained to her, get excluded from the official climate record entirely. Not delayed, not corrected later, erased from the moment of their formation, as though they had never existed at all. "Why?" I asked her, and she shrugged in a way that seemed rehearsed, the shrug of someone who had asked the same question once and had stopped asking it. "Above my clearance," she said. "Above yours too, probably. You get used to it." I didn't, not for a long time, but I learned to stop asking out loud because every time I did, the room got quieter in a way that made me feel like I'd said something rude at a funeral. Conversations about the excluded storms simply ended. Not with hostility, with a kind of soft, practiced redirection, the way you'd change the subject around someone grieving, except nobody was grieving, or if they'd been doing it so long it had calcified into procedure. Dale was the one who eventually gave me the clearest picture, though he didn't mean to, and he did it almost by accident 3 weeks into my first winter, during one of our perimeter walks. We'd finished checking the tower and were heading back when he stopped, without warning, in the middle of open ground, and stood very still, looking north toward nothing I could see. Just white on gray, the horizon a smear where the ground gave up trying to distinguish itself from the sky. "You ever notice the wind sock?" he said. "How it doesn't turn?" I told him I had, and that I'd assumed it was frozen or broken. "It's not broken," he said. "It's pointed at the last one. Nobody's fixed it because Voss says it's more accurate that way." I asked him what he meant by the last one, and he looked at me the way you look at someone who is asked a question they're not ready to hear the answer to, and he said, "Ask him yourself. I don't talk about the ones that don't get named." And then he kept walking and the conversation was over and my fingers were too cold to argue. That night, unable to sleep, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I pulled the last 6 weeks of official weather logs from the shared terminal and cross-referenced them against my own handwritten notes from the Stevenson screen readings, the ones I'd been keeping partly out of habit and partly because writing things down by hand has always helped me feel less like I was disappearing inside a place. And there, in the gap between my handwriting and the official record, I found 3 storm systems that I had personally logged temperature and pressure data for, real systems, real numbers, real hours of my life spent watching instruments respond to something moving through the atmosphere above us, that did not exist anywhere in the terminal at all. Not corrected. Not merged into another system's data. Simply absent, as though the hours themselves had been quietly folded out of the record, leaving no seam behind. I sat there in the dim light of the control room with my own notebook open beside a screen that insisted those hours had never happened, and for the first time since arriving at Kavik Point, I understood that the strangeness of this place wasn't an occasional glitch in an otherwise normal operation. It was the operation. The weather station was a shell built around something else, and the something else had rules, and I had just discovered that I'd been following them without ever being told what they were protecting me from. Section 3, Pattern Recognition. Once you notice a pattern like that, you cannot stop noticing it, and that is its own particular kind of curse. I started keeping 2 logs after that night, the official one, dutiful and complete and useless, and a private one, hidden inside a personal journal I kept under the false premise that I was documenting the psychological effects of isolation for my own benefit, which, in a way, I suppose I was. The unnamed storms, as I came to think of them, had a signature once I knew to look for it. They formed faster than the models predicted, sometimes appearing on radar with almost no antecedent conditions, no pressure gradient buildup, no moisture convergence, nothing that should have produced a storm cell of that intensity from what amounted to clear sky 20 minutes earlier. They moved with a rotational behavior the automated system consistently flagged as anomalous, a kind of tight, deliberate spiral that didn't match the loose, chaotic rotation of ordinary Arctic low-pressure systems. And they always, without exception, tracked toward the station itself before curving away at the last possible moment, missing us by a margin so narrow it felt less like weather and more like a decision. I brought this observation to Voss once, carefully, framing it as professional curiosity rather than suspicion, and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which I had learned by then was not a good sign with him. His silence was never comfortable, it was a kind of waiting. When I finished, he said, "The models are wrong about a lot of things up here. That's why we're here instead of a satellite." It was a true statement and an evasion at the same time, and I was beginning to understand that most of what came out of Voss's mouth operated on both levels simultaneously. The radio interference started around the same period, though I hesitate to call it interference because that word implies an external source disrupting a clean signal, and what happened to Hollow 6 transmissions felt more like the signal itself was occasionally displaced from where it should have been. Priya would be mid-transmission, reading off a pressure reading, and for 2 or 3 seconds the audio would drop into something that sounded almost like a room tone, the ambient hush of a much larger space than any radio equipment could produce, as if the frequency had briefly opened onto somewhere with high ceilings and no furniture, before snapping back to the flat procedural exchange as though nothing had happened. Priya never reacted to these moments. I asked her about it once, and she said, "Atmospheric ducting. Happens up here," in a tone that suggested she'd been given that explanation by someone else and had decided it was easier to repeat it than to examine it. The memory problems were harder to pin down and harder still to trust, because the nature of a memory problem is that you cannot fully verify its absence without external confirmation, and external confirmation was the one thing Kavik Point never offered freely. It began with small things. I would find myself standing in the hallway outside the equipment room with no memory of walking there. My hand already on the door handle, the last clear memory being something 10 or 15 minutes earlier at my desk. I would check a temperature log and find my own handwriting recording a reading I had no memory of taking, at an hour I believed I'd spent asleep. Once, I found a full page of my private journal filled with observations about a storm I had absolutely no recollection of witnessing. Detailed, specific, written in my own hand, describing wind behavior and a sound I'd apparently called the breathing. And I sat with that page for a long time, reading my own words like a stranger's confession, trying to locate even a single fragment of the experience it described, and finding nothing. Just the page. Just the handwriting. Just the absence where the memory should have been. I asked Dale, carefully, if he ever experienced anything like that. Gaps, missing time, things he'd apparently done that he couldn't remember doing. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer, and then he said, "Everybody who stays past their first winter has it happen. You stop counting after a while. It's easier." "Easier than what?" I asked. "Than trying to hold on to every hour like it matters," he said, and went back to his work, and I understood that this, too, was a piece of the acclimatization process nobody had warned me about during recruitment. Not just the cold, not just the isolation, but a slow erosion of confidence in your own continuous experience of time, delivered gradually enough that by the time you noticed it, you'd already half accepted it as the price of the job. What unsettled me most, more than the missing storms or the radio anomalies or even the gaps in my own memory, was how calm everyone remained inside all of it. Priya laughed the same easy laugh she'd had my first week. Dale still hummed old country songs while he worked on the generator. Voss still drank his coffee black and complained about the same cheap brand the supply drop always sent. There was no dread in any of them, no visible strain, and I remember thinking during my second month that their calm frightened me more than any single anomaly could have on its own, because it meant either they had found some genuine peace with whatever was happening here, or they had stopped being able to recognize how wrong it was, and I did not know which possibility disturbed me more. The storm that changed things arrived on a night in late November. During a shift I was covering alone while Priya slept and Dale worked on a generator issue in the shed. The radar had flagged a developing cell an hour earlier, unnamed, non-standard rotation, the familiar signature, and I watched it on the screen with the particular exhausted vigilance you develop when fear has become a background condition rather than an event. The wind outside built steadily, the building structure groaning under it in the way it always did, and I had grown almost used to the sound, almost able to work through it without flinching. And then, somewhere around 1:30 in the morning, beneath the wind, I heard something else. It wasn't loud. That's the detail I keep returning to, the detail that makes it worse in memory rather than easier to dismiss. It wasn't a howl, wasn't a crash, wasn't anything a storm should produce. It was a low, rhythmic sound, coming from somewhere outside the north wall, close enough that I felt it as much as heard it, a pattern that rose and fell with a regularity that had nothing to do with wind gusts, nothing to do with any weather process I had ever studied in 10 years of meteorology training. It sounded, more than anything else I can compare it to, like breathing, slow, deliberate, and far too large to belong to anything that should have been standing outside that wall in a storm nobody was allowed to name. Section 4. The Hidden System. I did not tell anyone about the sound that first night because I did not yet trust myself to describe it without sounding like a man who had spent too many hours alone with the wind, and there is a particular fear that comes with being the only witness to something. The fear that speaking it aloud will either make it more real or make you seem less credible, and neither option felt survivable at the time. I wrote it down in my private journal in flat, clinical language, the way I would have described any other environmental observation, because that language felt like the only container strong enough to hold it without letting it spill into something I couldn't manage. But I could not stop thinking about the red binder. It lived, as Voss had told me my first day, in a locked drawer beneath the main terminal, and over the following weeks I noticed that access to it followed a ritual nobody had explicitly taught me but that everyone seemed to understand instinctively. Only the shift lead touched it, only during specific windows and always alone, with the door to the control room closed. I began paying closer attention to when those windows occurred, and I noticed they correlated, without exception, with the unnamed storms. Whenever an anomalous cell was flagged and excluded from the official record, someone would retrieve the binder, write something inside it, and return it to the drawer, and the whole process took less than 3 minutes and was never discussed afterward. I got my chance in mid-December, during a supply changeover that pulled both Voss and Dale outside to help unload a cargo drop from a supply plane that had braved a narrow weather window, leaving me alone in the control room for the better part of 20 minutes. I told myself I was simply curious, that I would look and put it back and never mention it to anyone, and I believed that story for approximately as long as it took me to find the key, which was not hidden particularly well, taped beneath the terminal desk in a place that suggested nobody had ever truly worried about anyone looking. The binder was thinner than I expected. Inside, instead of narrative reports, I found rows of dense, coded shorthand, dates, coordinates, wind speed and pressure figures that matched storms I recognized from the official log's gaps, and beside each entry, a short string of letters and numbers I didn't recognize as any meteorological classification I'd ever studied. Designations like AX 14 contact sustained and X 09 NO contact, perimeter held, and, more disturbing than either of those, a recurring notation beside nearly a third of the entries that simply read, proximity loss. See personnel file. Near the back of the binder, tucked between pages rather than bound into them, I found something that did not belong to the official record at all. A handwritten page in a cramped, urgent script that was not Voss's handwriting and not Priya's or Dale's either, someone whose name I never learned, dated nearly 6 years earlier. It read, in part, that the storms were not weather in any conventional sense but atmospheric expressions of proximity, a phrase I copied into my own notebook because I did not understand it and hoped that writing it down might help me understand it later. It never did. The page went on to describe what the previous author called the pattern of approach, the way the unnamed systems had, over years of observation, grown incrementally closer to the station with each recurrence, not in a straight line, but in a slow, spiraling tightening, like something orbiting nearer with each pass. The final line on the page, before it ended abruptly, read, "We are not measuring the storms. We are being measured by them." I sat with that binder open on my lap for far longer than I should have, given how little time I had before Voss and Dale returned, and I remember feeling a specific kind of vertigo. Not fear exactly, or not only fear, but the sensation of having a floor I trusted turn out to be a thin membrane over something with no bottom at all. I photographed nothing, because I had been warned against it, and some deep animal part of my brain took that warning seriously even as the rest of me rebelled against every other rule I'd been given. I copied what I could into my notebook in the time remaining, closed the binder, returned the key to its hiding place, and was back at my station reviewing unrelated temperature logs when Voss walked back in, snow still melting off his shoulders, and looked at me for a moment longer than felt necessary. "Cold enough for you," he said, which wasn't a question, and I said something forgettable in response, and he went to hang up his coat, and that was the entire exchange, except that later, cleaning up before the evening shift change, I found something tucked into my own personal file folder in the supply cabinet. A folder I hadn't opened in weeks, containing my employment paperwork and medical clearance forms, a single index card that hadn't been there before, in handwriting I didn't recognize, that read only, "You'll find the binder eventually. Everyone does. Ask Voss about Whitfield when you're ready." I have turned that card over in my memory hundreds of times since, trying to determine whether it was a warning, an invitation, or something closer to a test, and I have never settled on an answer. What I know is that someone had anticipated my curiosity long before I acted on it, had left instructions for a version of me that hadn't yet decided to break the rules, and that fact unsettled me more than the binder itself because it meant the secrecy at Kavik Point wasn't fragile. It was designed with the expectation that people like me would eventually find the cracks, and it had already accounted for what I would do next. I did not sleep that night, turning the name Whitfield over in my mind, trying to place it among the sparse personnel records I'd seen, the supply manifests, the maintenance logs, and finding nothing. No employee file, no mention in the shift rotation history, nothing except, when I finally checked, a single reference in an old equipment inventory list from years before my arrival, beside a signature for a radio unit checked out and never checked back in, dated the same year as the handwritten page in the red binder. Section 5. Escalation. I waited 9 days before I said the name out loud to Voss, partly out of caution and partly because I was afraid of what silence would follow it, and when I finally did, during a quiet stretch of the evening shift, both of us watching a radar screen that showed nothing unusual for once. He set down his coffee with a deliberateness that told me he had been expecting the question for a long time, possibly since the day I arrived. Whitfield was station lead before me, he said. 19 years ago. He stayed for winters longer than his contract required. Volunteered for every extension. What happened to him? I asked. Voss looked at the radar screen instead of at me. He got closer to understanding it than anyone before or since. That's not a good thing to do out here. What is it? I asked. The thing in the storms. He was quiet long enough that I thought the conversation had ended the way all the others had, folding back into procedure, and then he said, in a voice stripped of the performative calm he usually wore like a second coat. I don't know. Nobody who's still talking knows. That's the whole system. We don't find out, we just don't let it find out too much about us either. Whitfield started keeping his own records outside the binder. Detailed ones. Personal theories. Within a year, he stopped sleeping through a full night. Within 2, he stopped remembering conversations he'd had an hour earlier. By his last winter, he wasn't reporting the storms with the rest of us anymore. He was reporting to them. I asked what that meant, and Voss gave me the closest thing to a direct answer he ever gave me in all the months I knew him. He started standing outside during them. Not fighting anything. Not surviving anything. Watching, the way you'd watch something you'd started to feel less afraid of than you should. The last storm he watched, he didn't come back in. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer this account. I did not feel terror, not in that moment. I felt a kind of cold, procedural dread, the sensation of watching a diagnosis confirm a symptom you'd been quietly nursing hope wasn't serious. I understood, sitting there, that the station's calm, Priya's laugh, Dale's humming, Voss's flat competence, wasn't peace. It was armor built out of not looking too closely, out of treating the unnamed storms the way you'd treat a dangerous neighbor you'd learned to never make eye contact with, and Whitfield had broken that discipline, and something in the story of his ending suggested the discipline existed for a reason far more literal than psychological hygiene. 3 days after that conversation, the storm that should not have existed began forming on radar. I say it should not have existed because the atmospheric conditions preceding it were, by every metric available to us, impossible for storm formation. Clear sky, stable high pressure, temperatures 30 degrees warmer than the threshold our own training manual cited as necessary for cell development. And yet at 4 in the afternoon the radar began registering a rotational mass building 40 miles out with a speed that outpaced every model we had, growing not from moisture convergence or pressure gradient but seemingly, impossibly, from nothing at all, as though the atmosphere itself had simply decided all at once to become something else. Voss called it before any of us had to say it aloud. This one's different, he said, watching the screen with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of grim, exhausted recognition. The look of a man watching a disease he thought was in remission return in a more aggressive form. The equipment began behaving incorrectly almost immediately. The anemometer, which should have registered increasing wind speed as the cell approached, instead reported a reading that dropped to 0 and stayed there, flatlined. Even as the building itself began to groan under wind we could all hear and feel. The barometric pressure sensor cycled through readings so rapidly they became meaningless, climbing and plummeting within seconds in a pattern that no genuine pressure system could produce. The radar display itself began to show what the software labeled, in a diagnostic error message none of us had seen before, as return signal exceeding expected object density, which Dale, staring at the screen with his jaw tight, translated for me without being asked. It's saying something's reflecting the radar beam back stronger than solid ground would. Something bigger and denser than anything that should be sitting in open air. Priya's radio call to Hollow 6 that evening lasted longer than any I'd heard before, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I heard something in the regional operator's flat voice that sounded almost like urgency, instructing her through a sequence of protocols I hadn't heard used before, designations and code phrases that had the cadence of things memorized under duress rather than routine. When she finished the call and set down the handset, her hands, I noticed, were not quite steady, though her voice, when she spoke to me, remained level. "We're going to full lockdown protocol," she said. "Voss will walk you through it. Just do exactly what he says. Exactly when he says it, and don't look out any window facing north after dark." I asked her why, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not her usual practiced neutrality, but something closer to genuine fear held very tightly in check, and she said, "Because last time somebody did, they couldn't tell us afterward what they saw. They just stopped being able to talk about the color of anything at all. Every object, every single day after that, they said was the wrong color. Nobody could ever tell what that meant, because he couldn't explain it either. He just knew colors were wrong now, forever, and it broke something in him that never came back." Section 6. Survival Procedures. The lockdown protocol, when Voss walked me through it that evening, had the eerie thoroughness of something rehearsed by people who had refined it across years of necessity, and every part of it operated on a logic that had nothing to do with any storm safety procedure I'd studied during my training. We moved through the station switching off every light on the north-facing side of the building, not dimming them, switching them off entirely, and covering the remaining windows with insulated shutters that I hadn't previously noticed were even installed, folded flush against the wall frames as though built into the structure from the beginning rather than added as an afterthought. Dale killed the exterior floodlights around the tower and generator shed, plunging the compound into a darkness so complete it felt less like the absence of light and more like a presence in its own right, something that had been waiting behind the light the whole time and was only now permitted to come forward. We moved through the remaining lit rooms with a deliberate, unhurried quiet that Voss insisted on, correcting Dale once, sharply, when he let a metal cabinet door swing shut with an audible clang. "Not loud," Voss said. "Not tonight." I asked him, as we worked, why sound mattered, and he said, without looking up from the shutter he was securing, "We don't know if it matters. We know it seemed to matter the times it went badly. So we don't take the chance." The radio went silent by design, Priya powering down every transmitter in the building except a single battery-backed receiver tuned to Hollow 6 emergency frequency, set to the lowest audible volume because, as she explained without elaboration, transmitting during one of these draws it toward the signal we think, though nobody's ever proven it and nobody wants to be the one who proves it. We gathered in the interior hallway, the one room in the station with no exterior walls at all, sealed on every side by other rooms, lit by a single battery lantern rather than the overhead fluorescence, which Voss switched off entirely, explaining that the electrical hum of standard lighting had been flagged years earlier, in circumstances he didn't elaborate on, as something that seemed to draw unwanted attention during these events. We sat on the floor, the three of them with the practiced stillness of people who had done this many times before, and me, trying to mirror their calm and failing at it in small, visible ways. My hands finding tasks to occupy them, my breathing shallow and too fast, my mind refusing to settle into the strange meditative patience the others seemed to access without effort. The power failed at 11:40, the backup generator kicking in exactly as designed, and Dale's shoulders relaxed slightly at the sound of it catching, though he didn't speak. The pressure in the building began to change shortly after. Not dramatically, not in any way an instrument would necessarily flag as extraordinary, but in a way my body registered before my mind did. A fullness in my ears, a faint ringing that came and went, the specific unpleasant sensation of a rapid altitude change compressed into a room that hadn't moved at all. "Equalize if you need to," Priya said quietly, and I realized I'd been holding my jaw tense without noticing, and I worked to release it, swallowing against the pressure, and the ringing eased slightly, though it never fully disappeared. The sound began sometime after midnight, and this time all three of us heard it, which meant I finally had confirmation that I hadn't imagined it those weeks before. The low, rhythmic pattern, rising and falling with unhurried regularity, coming from somewhere that seemed to shift location every few minutes, sometimes close to the north wall, sometimes impossibly, seeming to come from directly above the roof, sometimes from a direction that had no exterior wall at all, as though it had somehow gotten inside the geometry of the building itself without passing through any door or window. Dale's hand found the flashlight beside him and gripped it without turning it on, a reflex rather than a decision, and Priya closed her eyes, her lips moving slightly in what I eventually recognized, with some surprise, as counting. A slow, steady count that I understood instinctively I was meant to follow along with, though nobody had explained why, and I did, letting the numbers replace the sound in my attention as best I could, though it never fully worked, the breathing pattern always. There beneath the numbers, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to whether we noticed it or not. Voss sat with his back against the wall, eyes open, watching the hallway's single door with an attentiveness that had nothing frantic in it, only a deep, practiced readiness, and at one point, without turning his head, he said quietly, to nobody in particular, "It's further out than the last one. Give it time." I asked him, my voice lower than I intended, how he could tell the distance from a sound that seemed to move in every direction at once, and he said, "You get a feel for the room it's using. Sound doesn't travel like that unless something big is standing where it shouldn't be, close enough that the walls stop meaning anything to it." I did not understand what he meant by the walls not meaning anything. Not that night, though the phrase stayed lodged in me the way certain sentences do, waiting for a context that would eventually make them worse rather than better. We sat in that hallway for 4 hours by the small clock Dale kept beside him, the breathing sound rising and falling, sometimes distant enough to convince myself it might be nothing at all, sometimes close enough that the air itself seemed to compress around it, and somewhere in the third hour, exhausted past the point of fear into a kind of numb endurance, I realized that none of us had spoken in a very long time, and that the counting Priya had started had stopped, and that I had lost, somewhere in that silence, a stretch of time I could not account for, the clock reading nearly 40 minutes later than the last moment I remembered clearly, with no memory at all of what had filled the gap. Section 7. Partial Revelation. The storm ended, or at least the sound ended, sometime near dawn, though none of us marked the exact moment it stopped, because by then exhaustion had thinned our attention down to almost nothing, and it was only when Dale finally stood, joints cracking audibly in the quiet, that I realized the breathing pattern was simply gone, replaced by the ordinary structural creak of a building settling in cold, and beneath that, for the first time in hours, the wind, actual wind, mundane and explicable, scattering loose snow against the shutters in a way that felt absurdly like relief. We didn't discuss the missing time that morning. I brought it up once, carefully mentioning the gap in the clock, the stretch of counting that had simply stopped without anyone acknowledging it had stopped, and Priya's response was so immediate and so practiced that I understood she had given this exact answer before, possibly many times, to other people who had noticed the same thing. "It happens near the end," she said. "Nobody's ever explained why. You just learn the last hour or so doesn't always stay with you afterward, and you learn not to chase it too hard, because chasing it is worse than losing it." I did not take her advice. I understand now that not taking it was probably the point at which whatever remained of my old, careful caution finally gave way to something closer to compulsion, and I have to be honest that I don't entirely regret it, even now, even knowing what it cost. I went back to the red binder within the week, this time not during a brief window of opportunity but deliberately, waiting until a night when Voss was asleep and Priya was on shift in the control room and Dale was working late in the generator shed, and I let myself into the drawer with the same key, and this time I didn't limit myself to copying entries. I read the entire binder, cover to cover, in the dim light of a small desk lamp, and what I found there rearranged the shape of everything I thought I understood about Kovic Point. The station, according to the earliest entries, had not begun as a weather monitoring facility at all. It had been established, decades before any of the current staff arrived, as an observation post for what the original documentation referred to only as recurring atmospheric anomalies with confirmed biological correlate. A phrase that took me several readings to fully absorb because it meant, as plainly as anything in that binder ever stated anything plainly, that the storms were not simply strange weather. They were the visible signature of something moving through the atmosphere in a form that interacted with pressure, temperature, and radar the way weather does, but that was not whether in any sense the word had ever meant to me. The entries used the phrase "the presence" more often than any other term, always with a kind of weary consistency, as though the writers had exhausted generations ago whatever appetite they'd once had for more dramatic language, and had settled instead on something flat and administrative because flat and administrative was the only way to keep doing the job without breaking. There were references, scattered across years of handwriting from people I would never meet, to a program overseeing multiple stations, not just Kavik Point, positioned across specific stretches of the Arctic and, more disturbingly, in a handful of entries, referencing the Antarctic counterpart sites, implying an operation with a scope and a duration far beyond anything I had imagined. When I signed my contract, the stated purpose of the program, as far as I could piece it together from years of terse annotations, was never to stop the presence, never to understand it in any complete sense, and certainly never to defeat it. The purpose, repeated in different handwriting across different decades in nearly identical language, was containment of information and preservation of personnel. A phrase that I read several times before its full weight settled on me, because it meant the entire structure of the station, every procedure, every silence, every red binder entry, existed not to protect the world from the storms but to keep the world from ever learning the storms existed at all, and to keep just enough of us alive, shift after shift, decade after decade, to maintain that silence indefinitely. One entry, dated 11 years before my arrival, wrote plainly, "We are not a defense. We are a witness that has agreed never to testify." Another, several years later, in different handwriting, added beneath it, "We were never meant to win this. We were only ever meant to survive it quietly enough that nobody outside ever has to." I sat with that sentence longer than any other in the entire binder, because it did something to the shape of my fear. It didn't resolve it, didn't explain the presence itself, didn't tell me what moved through those storms or why it circled closer to this particular patch of frozen ground decade after decade, but it told me, with a bluntness nothing else in my time at Kavik Point had offered, exactly what my role in all of it actually was. I was not here to protect anyone. I was not here to understand anything. I was here to log numbers, maintain silence, and, if the pattern held the way it apparently always had, eventually become another name in a binder that some future employee would read alone at a desk lamp, wondering the same things I was wondering now. I closed the binder that night with a decision already forming in me, one I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, though I recognize now, looking back, exactly when it took root. Somewhere in the space between reading Whitfield's fate and reading that final sentence about witnessing rather than testifying, I decided that I could not simply keep logging numbers for a system that had already told me, in its own words, that survival was the only victory on offer, and that I would find some way, before my contract ended, to see the thing directly rather than merely hear its breathing through a wall, because I had convinced myself, in the particular delusion of someone who has read too much and slept too little, that understanding it, even partially, would be better than continuing to live inside its silence. Section 8. The Final Storm. I did not tell anyone what I intended, partly because I did not fully understand my own intention until I was already acting on it, and partly because some part of me suspected, correctly, that Voss or Priya or Dale would have stopped me if they'd known, not out of cruelty but out of the exhausted, practiced protectiveness of people who had already lost someone to exactly this kind of curiosity. The largest storm of the season began forming on a night in late January, and from the moment the radar flagged it, I understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with instrumentation, that this one was different from every storm before it, including the one that had put us into full lockdown weeks earlier. The rotational signature was tighter, faster, and the radius of the developing cell was larger than anything in the historical data I'd reviewed in the binder, and Voss, watching the same readout beside me, went very still in a way that told me he recognized the same thing I did, even before either of us said it aloud. "This is the big one," he said finally, and something in his voice had shed its usual flatness entirely, replaced by something closer to old grief. "I haven't seen a signature like this since Whitfield's last winter." The lockdown protocol began earlier than before, hours before the storm's projected arrival, and this time the preparation felt different, heavier, more careful, Dale checking the generator twice instead of once, Priya running through her emergency frequency checks with a thoroughness that bordered on ritual, Voss moving through the building's ceiling shutters with the grim efficiency of a man who had done this exact task the night someone he cared about did not come back inside. I waited until they were occupied, Dale in the generator shed, Priya running her final radio checks, Voss making one last pass of the exterior door seals, and I took the exterior gear from the equipment locker, the heaviest parka rated for conditions far beyond anything the wind chill charts described as survivable, and I let myself out through the maintenance door on the building's south side, the one side the lockdown protocol didn't bother sealing because the presence, according to years of recorded pattern, always seemed to approach from the north. I want to be honest that I do not remember most of what happened outside with the clarity I would want, and I have come to believe that this is not simply the effect of panic or cold, but something closer to what Whitfield experienced, something the presence itself does to memory as a kind of side effect of proximity, the way a bright light leaves an afterimage that erases whatever was behind it. What I remember is fragments, and I will give them to you exactly as fragmented as they exist in me, because I no longer trust myself to smooth them into something more coherent than what actually remains. I remember the wind stopping entirely, all at once, the way it had that first night at the window, an absence so total it felt like pressure rather than silence. I remember the sky above the north side of the building losing its color in a way I cannot adequately describe. Not going dark, not going white, but seeming to withdraw from the category of color altogether, becoming a kind of visual static that my eyes kept trying and failing to resolve into something familiar. I remember the ground beneath the snow vibrating with the low rhythm I had heard through walls for weeks, except now there was no wall between us, and the sound had a size to it that no wall had ever fully conveyed, a size that made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with cold. I remember, and this is the fragment I trust least and fear most, a stretch of open ground beyond the tower where the snow had been disturbed in a pattern too symmetrical to be wind, a shape pressed into the surface that I could not fully see because looking at it directly produced a specific, immediate nausea, a wrongness in my inner ear that made the horizon tilt, and I remember understanding, without being told, without any instrument confirming it, that whatever had made that shape was very close, close enough that the air between us carried a temperature gradient I could feel against my exposed cheeks. Warm in a way nothing in that landscape should ever have been warm. I remember a voice, and I want to be careful here because I do not know if the voice was real in any sense that would satisfy an investigator or a doctor or anyone who wasn't standing in that specific place at that specific moment. It did not use words, not in the way words work in ordinary speech, but it produced in me an impression, a meaning arriving without language attached to it, and the meaning, as close as I can translate it into something communicable, was something like recognition. Not hostility, not hunger, nothing that mapped cleanly onto any fear I'd carried into that night, but a vast, patient, almost bureaucratic acknowledgement of my presence there, the way you might register a familiar object in a room you'd walked through 1,000 times before. I remember Voss's voice after that, real and human and furious with fear disguised as anger, hauling me backward by the collar of the parka, shouting words I couldn't process at the time and can only partially reconstruct now. Something about the door, something about not looking at it, something about Whitfield repeated twice, like a name that had become a warning in its own right. I remember the interior hallway again, the lantern light, Dale's hands checking me for frostbite with a clinical urgency that told me more time had passed outside than I remembered experiencing. And I remember, more than anything else, the exact moment the storm ended. Not gradually, not the way real weather dissipates, but instantly, completely, the sound and the pressure and the wrongness in the sky simply ceasing all at once, as though something had finished what it came to do and had no further use for the performance of a storm at all, leaving behind only an ordinary, freezing Arctic night, and 4 people in a hallway, 3 of them familiar with this silence and one of them, for the first time, understanding exactly why they never spoke about it afterward. Section 9, Cold Aftermath. I do not know how long I was outside. Dale said it was less than 20 minutes. Priya, when I asked her separately days later, said it felt closer to 2 hours from where she sat monitoring the emergency frequency, and Voss, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask him directly, simply said, "Time doesn't mean the same thing out there. Stop asking, it won't ever add up." And I understood, from the finality in his voice, that this was the last conversation we would ever have about it. The official records showed nothing. When I checked the terminal 3 days later, the storm that had nearly cost me everything did not appear anywhere in the logs, not as an excluded event, not as a non-designated cell, not as anything at all, no trace, no gap, even the kind of absence so complete it left no seam behind. Exactly like the storms I'd discovered missing my first month, except this time I had been standing outside in it, and I had a frostbite scar along my left cheekbone that the base doctor, flown in briefly the following week, described in his report as consistent with exposure of undetermined duration. A phrase that satisfied nobody and explained nothing and was, I later understood, exactly the kind of phrase the entire system had been built to produce. Voss never brought up that night again, not once, in the remaining months of my contract, and neither did Priya or Dale, though something had shifted permanently in how they looked at me afterward. Not suspicion exactly, and not warmth either, but a kind of quiet inclusion, as though I had finally been admitted into a membership none of us had ever formally discussed, a fellowship defined entirely by having stood too close to something and having been allowed, for reasons none of us understood, to come back. I finished my 12-month rotation. I flew out on a gray morning in early spring, the tundra beginning its brief, grudging thaw beneath a plane that carried me back toward Deadhorse and, eventually, toward a life that no longer fit the way it used to. I did not sign on for another rotation, though Voss asked me to in his flat way during my final debrief, telling me the program valued people who'd gotten past the first winter without losing themselves entirely. And I told him I needed time, and he nodded as though he'd expected that answer, and gave me a number to call if I ever changed my mind, a number that, when I tried it 8 months later out of some impulse I still can't fully explain, connected to nothing but a long, flat dial. Tone that never resolved into anything. I have spent the years since trying to build a normal life around the edges of what happened at Kavik Point, and I want to tell you that it worked, that I found a way to fold that year into a manageable shape and move forward, but that would not be honest, and honesty is the only thing I still owe this account. I flinch at low, rhythmic sounds I can't immediately identify. I do not sleep well during storms, even ordinary ones, even the kind that pose no threat to anyone. I have caught myself more than once, standing at a window during heavy weather with no memory of walking there, my hand pressed against the glass, and I have learned not to examine those moments too closely, because Dale was right all those months ago. Chasing the missing time is worse than losing it. I tried twice to find any public record of Kavik Point Station, and both times I found nothing that matched what I remembered. No listing under that name, no personnel records, no contractor connected to the company that had hired me, as though the entire apparatus I'd spent a year inside had been designed to leave no more trace in official history than the storms themselves left in the weather logs. I do not know if the station is still operating. I suspect it is. I suspect Voss is still there, or someone like him, walking a new arrival through the same rules about the red binder, the same instructions about which storms never get named, and I suspect that somewhere in that binder, beneath Whitfield's entry and beneath whatever entry eventually got written about me, there is space left for whoever comes next, because the pattern the earliest documents described, the slow, patient tightening of the presence's approach across years of recurrence, never once suggested an ending. It only ever suggested continuation. I think about that phrase from the binder more than any other memory I carry from that year. We were never meant to win this. I understand it differently now than I did the night I first read it. I thought, then, that it meant defeat, that somewhere ahead of every person who ever worked at that station lay some final, catastrophic confrontation we were destined to lose. I don't believe that anymore. I believe it meant something quieter and, in its own way, worse, that winning was never the objective anyone had ever been given, that the entire purpose of the program, the silence, the excluded storms, the memory gaps, all of it, was simply to keep enough of us functional enough for long enough to maintain a witness that could never speak indefinitely forever with no resolution built into the design at all. I still don't know what stood outside that building the night the sky lost its color. I never will, and I have made a kind of peace with that not knowing that I couldn't have imagined making during my first month there, when every unanswered question felt like an emergency. It isn't peace exactly. It's closer to the particular calm you find at the bottom of exhaustion. The calm Voss and Priya and Dale all carried the entire time I knew them. The calm I understand now as the true cost of the job rather than some coincidental symptom of it. Somewhere north of Deadhorse, on a shelf of frozen ground with no trees and no color and a windsock that never turns, a light is probably on right now in a control room I used to sit in, and someone I've never met is probably logging a temperature reading that means nothing, waiting for a storm that will arrive without a name, and there is a red binder in a locked drawer with room left inside it for whatever gets written next. I do not know if that thought should frighten you. It still frightens me most nights, more than anything I actually witnessed out there in the snow. Not the storm, not the sound, just the plain, cold fact that it is still happening, somewhere, right now, to someone who has no idea yet what they've agreed to, and that nothing I said here will ever reach them in time to change what they're about to learn about the shape of the silence they've just